Hi, I'm Barrett.
And I'm Brandon.
And we are Bionic Fitness.
We talk a lot in our videos about range of motion, about flexibility, about mobility, and how that applies to functionality and movement in our body. It's super important. Aside from being able to do the splits, how is that relevant to our workouts, and why is range of motion super important?
So this is why we're talking about stretching today. Range of motion is really important within that strength training and within any sort of exercise that you do, because if you don't have the proper range of motion, that can actually lead to impingement within your joints, tension within certain muscles, and of course injury as well. And we want to prevent injury as much as possible.
We've talked earlier about how the nervous system is something that's really neglected in fitness. When we look at range of motion and muscle tension and joint compression, we also look at nerve and artery pathways being compressed and things kind of becoming dysfunctional.
And of course, if you think about it this way, if you have tight muscles and they are compressing those arteries and those nerve pathways, that's going to lead to dysfunction within certain muscles, and it can lead to two different things. It can either lead to the muscle loosening and weakening, or it can lead to tension and compression, additional compression as well.
That chronic compression can really cause pinching and pain in joints and limbs, which we really obviously want to avoid, especially going into our workouts.
Another thing to keep in mind too is that as we age, we become less flexible, and of course we want to maintain as much flexibility as possible. That's going to lead you to being a stronger, healthier person in general. So, who wants to see Brandon stretch?
Yeah, kick, stretch, and kick!
So, I'm going to lead Brandon through a number of stretches, and we're going to talk about why they are important and how to stretch. So, Brandon, if I could get you to pull a pillow forward, we're going to start with a quadriceps stretch. So, your quadriceps are the big muscles on the fronts of your thighs. Yeah, baby. So, Brandon is going to be using the trunks to put his foot up against.
I like to use trunks.
And you can use your sofa, you can use the wall, whatever works for you. So, what Brandon is doing, he's got his toe positioned. You can bring it down a little bit too if you want to. If that's not a comfortable position, you can point it downward a little bit more. But he's got his knee propped against a pillow, of course. And what he's doing right now is he is tucking his pelvis underneath him, so he's reducing that anterior pelvic tilt. He's bringing it into a more neutral position. He is squeezing the glutes as well to help keep that in place, and he's in fact squeezing his abs, pulling them in and up towards his head. And this is going to, of course, bring that stretch right into those quads and that hip flexor in front.
I've got my hands on my hips to make sure that one's not hiking up higher than the other, or I'm also not tilting. So I can kind of gauge where my pelvis is in space by putting my hands on my hips and tucking that way in a nice even way.
That's great. So we're not going to get Brandon to do the full stretches. That would take a really long time. So we're just doing this for demonstration purposes. So you can stop, and we'll move on to our next one, which is a hip flexor stretch. Now, while it looks similar, it's slightly different. He's going to do the same process. Except he's going to have his foot down off of the trunks, okay? But he's basically tucking underneath, getting rid of that anterior pelvic tilt, pulling those abs in, squeezing that glute, and now I'm going to get him, yes, to lean forward, glide forward into that hip flexor stretch. Yeah, that's great. And you should be feeling this a little higher up. You won't be feeling it low in the lower part of the leg, but more closer on top of that hip. Another great thing to add too is if you want to get a bigger stretch, you can of course support yourself on that knee, but a bigger stretch, you can bring that same arm up overhead. Yes, and lean slightly to the other side, and that's going to in fact bring another big stretch in. That's actually doing a little bit of fascial line work. Fascia is of course a tissue that surrounds your muscles, and that can get tight in and of itself, so we want to stretch that too. We're going to talk more about that in a foam rolling video we're going to produce, but for now that's a little extra for you right now.
Also make sure that you're not arching into your lower back too much. This happens a lot, right? So lean forward, abs engaged, and by squeezing the glute, I'm able to extend the hip and get a little extra stretch to the hip flexor on that side.
Exactly. Great. Okay, that's a great stretch for your hip flexors. Next one, we're going to move into the groin, or your adductors. Okay, so Brandon is going to stay down on that one knee. All right, And he is in fact going to take his other leg directly out to the side. Brandon is fairly flexible, as you can see, so he can dip down. If you can bring it up a little bit just so that everyone can see, so bring those hips up. There we go. So what he's doing, he's got one leg down, the knee is on the pillow, and the other leg is straight out. His foot is flat. If you can't quite see that, but his foot is actually flat on the ground. It's not tilted. He's not on the edge of his foot. There we go. He's brought it back a bit so you can see that. And then basically what he's doing, he's keeping his back in a nice neutral position, right? He's got his shoulders pulled back and down, and he's keeping his abs engaged. So this is actually keeping his pelvis in a correct position to hit those adductors or the inner thigh muscles right underneath here, right through here. You guys might feel this all the way down into the knee, all the way up into the pelvic area.
A couple of things I like to do to kind of intensify the stretch for myself and to also keep it dynamic a little bit is I'll rock my hips forward, backwards, and just go through that. I also give myself a little tailbone tuck, a little cat-cow action there. Or I'll also focus on the kneecap and point it down, point it up. Point it down, point it up.
What this is doing is it's actually moving through all the different fibers in your adductors. This is really important as there are many different adductors along that inner thigh area. And you want to hit as many as you can to get that nice stretch through them, okay? Great. We're going to move on to our hamstrings. So those are the muscles in the back of your thigh, okay? We've got a few different options for that. Let's do our classic one, which is the hurdlers or modified hurdlers stretch. Everyone probably knows this one. So you can do it with both of your legs. So this is just a lean forward. There's also another one where you can bring one foot into the knee, and that'll like so, that Brandon's demonstrating. Everyone has seen this one more than likely. This one is really not about necessarily reaching your foot, but it's more about proper positioning and feeling the stretch. So I'm going to start Brandon back up at the top. And as you can see, he's sitting up nice and tall. He's got his abs engaged, and he's actually leaning forward through that hip joint. So you don't want to think of this as you're curving through the back, but you're leaning forward through that hip joint. Yeah, so that's a curve through the back, and now he's leaning forward through that hip joint. Brandon's tall, and he's got some long arms, so he can reach his feet, but not everyone might be able to. If you can only reach, say, your ankle or your calf or your mid-shin, that's fine. Or even if you can only reach your knee, don't worry about it. It's more about feeling that stretch through the back of that leg. That's great. Another thing to remember while you are stretching, of course, is that you want to hold the stretch while you are static stretching, which means the goal of your stretching is to lengthen the muscle. You want to hold it for at least 20 seconds, or a nice slow count of 20 to 30 seconds or longer. The more you hold it, the better the stretch could be. If you are really tight in some of these muscles, it's always a good idea to just hold it for that little bit longer. That'll help you a lot.
You've got a couple of things in your muscles called muscle spindles, and in your tendons called Golgi tendon organs, which are basically little nerves that try to keep a little bit of tension in the muscle so that if it gets pulled suddenly, it doesn't rip. It has somewhere to go. It's kind of springy like an elastic, right?
Exactly.
After about 30 seconds to a minute, that's where those nerves will start to let go and allow you to ease into that stretch. So if you ever notice that after about 30 seconds you can get deeper into your stretch, that's because those nerves have let go.
That signal has been sent. So that's great for hamstrings. Let's move on to some glutes. So the glutes are, of course, your butt. So those are the two big muscles that cross the back of your thighs up to your pelvis. Okay. So Brandon's got a great one here. You might know this from yoga. This one is called pigeon. So basically what he's doing, he's got his leg forward, and his leg is more or less perpendicular to his torso, perpendicular to his hip as well, as you can see, just like so. Now, if you can't quite get your leg in this position, that's fine. If you need to bring your foot back a bit and ease your way into this position, that's fine, no problem. He has his other leg extended fully behind him and lengthened, and he should be feeling this stretch from his glute up here all the way underneath. The glute, of course, like we said, crosses that hip. It goes from the pelvis all the way down to that femur. And this is a big stretch for it. It's great. You might also feel this a little bit in that inner thigh, in those adductors, if you're tight there as well.
Should we do the laying down glute one?
Yeah, let's do a laying down glute. So if you find that you can't get into that pigeon position, you have another option. You are welcome. There are a few different options for this. You can cross the leg over, of course, and do like a pigeon on your back, okay? Slightly different. You're going to lace your fingers together in behind that knee of the other leg, crossing the ankle over that knee, and then pulling it towards you. If you find this is difficult, basically if you find that you're really tight in your glutes, a lot of people aren't, but some people are. Another option is just to basically keep that leg straight and pull the knee towards your chest. That's another good one if you find that you're really tight. Of course, there's also a seated option as well. You can sit up and do the same thing. Cross the leg over. Yep, sit.
Should do it on the couch.
Yeah, sure. Cross the leg over, and then basically all you're doing is sitting up straight, pushing that knee down, and leaning forward a little bit, and that'll help too. That's a good glute stretch. A last one, of course, that we're going to do is our calves. So our calves are the big muscles that cross the behind of your lower leg. And a great one to do for this is downward dog, which is also another yoga stretch. So Brandon is going to push back into his shoulders, lifting his hips straight up into the air, and he's going to try and keep his heels down on the ground. This is going to get that big stretch through the calves. You also might feel this a little bit in your hamstrings, in the back of your thighs, and that's fine too. One thing that's really important that Brandon does is he's trying to keep his pelvis in a good position. He's actually trying to, if you can move it a little bit there, Brandon, yeah, that's great. So what he's doing, he's actually pushing it into a little tiny bit of an anterior pelvic tilt, but as you can see, his back is still nice and flat. It's not actually curving, and that's because a lot of people will in fact allow their backs to round, and that will keep it out of those hamstrings and keep it out of those calves. So we don't want to have your back or your lower back rounded during this downward dog stretch. A great way to do this too is you can pedal your feet. So basically pushing one heel into the ground and then switching back and forth. It's a great way to get a little extra stretch in those calves without having to really push both legs down, if that's too much. Good. That's great, Brandon. Thank you. There are a number of different stretches, a number of different ways to stretch. If you do a little research online, I'm sure you can find a whole bunch of stretching videos. We just wanted to go over some basics for your lower body today. Another thing to keep in mind too is whenever you're stretching, you never want to stretch into pain. You always want to be moved to tension, but not pain. Pain can actually be counterproductive to stretching. A lot of people think that they really have to dig into the stretch, but that's not necessary. In fact, it can work against you because those muscles will in fact want to grip. What Brandon talked about, those neural signals will actually grip instead of relax.
When you experience an injury or pain, what your body wants to do is stabilize that joint so that it's not able to move as well, so that it can heal, right? And so when you experience pain or an injury, everything around that area will tighten up. So if you're stretching, like Barrett said, through pain, you're actually being counterproductive and causing things to tighten up.
Of course. We want to think of it as a comfortable discomfort. So something that you can hold on to that you feel is not too much, but you're still stretching, right? So guys, happy stretching and happy working out. If you have any questions or concerns, please leave them in the comments below. You can also email us, which will be in the description. And of course, follow us on Instagram, which will also be in this description as well.
We recommend you to stretch at least 2 or 3 times a week. Just make sure you're nice and open. Everybody's a little different, obviously, and it depends on your sport and what you're doing, but keep that mobility up and take your time with it.
It also helps when you're a little warmed up too. So do it after your workout just to maintain that mobility and that range of motion.
Enjoy it, make sure you're breathing, and have a good stretch.
Thanks guys. Bye.